So the thing you need in front of you is a copy of the handover sheet, and it's good to also have a reference of actually having access to one of the price books, because obviously the lens maps give you a lot of detail about some of the stuff we're talking about. So what we're actually going to start talking about is, first of all, my most important prop today is a glass of water. Strangely enough, a lot of the stuff when we talk about lenses actually relate to water. When we talk about, and I'll give you the first example, one of the first examples we're going to talk about is refractive index. So refractive index you'll sort of see on the numbers on some of the lens mats and other things, and we'll talk about specifying refractive index, and refractive index can be something like 1.5 if the standard CR39 material, so a standard plastic lens we use, which has been around for a long time but still an excellent lens material. Fairly light, fairly strong, it's not suitable for rimless because of chipping, it's got very good optical clarity, but not particularly great in super high scripts because of the fact that it does start to get a bit thicker. And then we've got materials like 1.53, 1.56, 1.6, there's even one at 1.61 occasionally. And so there's all these different materials, 1.67, there's all these different materials that are available, and each one of those materials generally relate to things. And sometimes there are trade names or brand names associated with that, like CR39 for 1.5, Phoenix or Trivex for 1.53. There's other, I don't know a trade name associated with the 156. A 1.6 in Hawaii, for instance, they use the term EAS to specify their 1.6. 1.61 is another one that's not as common, but it's around as well. 1.67, I think Hawaii uses the term Inoa for that one. So you can see that there's different things. But relatively, what do these numbers relate to? Well, basically, water, you can make lenses out of water as well. It's pretty easy to see that. If I hold that up and you've got a glass there, you can see it's got a curved surface on both sides, it's got a glass of water in it, and you actually see you can change and distort things in the background. It can actually focus things or unfocus things. So water, if you like, has a refractive index. Strangely enough, we use water as our baseline. Refractive index of water is the reference. It's 1.0. So basically, if it says 1.5, it's saying it bends light 1.5 times more effectively than water. If it's 1.6, it bends it 1.6 times more effectively than water. 1.67 says 1.67 times, or 67% more effective at bending light with the same amount of curve as water. So that's refractive index. Now refractive index is really a common term you'll see, but basically the higher the number, the better it bends light. And so if we basically go back a step, we know about lenses. Lenses look like, there's a couple of different forms, and we talk about best form or the profile of a lens, or how we make or structure the lens to try and give it good optical properties, and there's all sorts of different terms that relate to that, and we'll touch on those a little bit later. But first of all, a lens may have effectively a more plus form or a more minus form, and you will have seen these. So we'll call this plus, this one minus. I need to wipe that screen a bit better. A plus and minus. So basically, for this given curve and volume of the lens, this power here, if it had a say if it had a 1.5 index, it might have a certain focus power, and so let's call this focus power plus 3. Strangely enough, you go and take that same lens, and you'll excuse my drawing, the same lens with the same curve, as in same curve, same volume, same shape lens, and then you go and put a 1.6 in it, index in it, you will find that the power of that lens will actually be proportionally stronger than 3. It'll be something probably like about, well, in proportion in mathematical terms, you basically say how much more is 1.6 over 1.5. Well, it's around about, just under 10% more, isn't it? It's probably about 8% more. So you'll probably find the power of that lens now wouldn't be plus 3, it would be probably closer to plus 3 and a bit. Around 10% more, probably, it might be about 3.25. And if it has a 1.67 lens, and we'll do the same thing again, then it's going to actually be a little bit more again effective, and so that might make that lens almost plus a little bit greater than between plus 350 and plus 375 would be somewhere there. So that's not how we work with indexes though. What we do with indexes is basically say we want our clients to have a nice thin lens, not a big chunky thick lens. So what we actually say is, well, the other thing is also true. So I'll just take this away there. I might just take that one away. If that's a 1.5, if we wanted to use a 1.6, exaggerate, a 1.67, and we still want it to be plus 3, effectively we can now draw that curve flatter and smaller. Probably doesn't look that much flatter and smaller, but we can now draw it flatter and smaller because the lens index is higher. So if you like, rather than just saying, okay, we don't take people's glasses and go, okay, we're going to make them a certain curve and a certain thickness, and now we'll make it thinner just to make them a greater power. What we actually say is, here's the power we want, but we'd also like it to be nice and thin. The higher index we use, the thinner the lens gets. Okay? But again, it all comes back to the reference point of, 1 being water. Now, do we need to necessarily know that 1 is water? No, not particularly, but the interesting thing is we also use water as there's another feature that we talk about lenses, and you don't talk it as often, but when we start to get to understand different materials and the different properties of materials like impact resistance or how scratch resistant or how stable they are to chemicals. So each of these lens materials have different properties, and one of them is index. Another one is actually something we call specific gravity. Now, if you go and take the handout sheets from Polera or the cutout things, often down the bottom they'll talk about Abbe numbers and refractive indexes, and one of the things they'll also talk about is specific gravity. So specific gravity basically relates to if you have something that is, if you actually have something that has a certain volume, a spherical round thing, or even if let's make it a cube. See how well I'm good at drawing cubes. So we've got a volume or a mass or a space. If we fill that space with water, it's going to weigh a certain amount. If we fill it with lead, it's going to weigh a lot more. If we fill it with feathers or air, it's going to weigh a lot less. It'll have a weight even with air, but the weight will be obviously far less. If you fill it with oil, oil is a little bit lighter than water. It floats on top, so it's going to be fractionally lighter. If you fill it with something else that's more dense than water, such as stones, it's going to be heavier still. So specific gravity basically talks about how heavy it is for the mass or the volume of lens or volume of space. Now, of course,
is that your Abbe as well? Is that what you're talking?
Abbe's got a different thing, and it's got properties about how well it bends light and keeps all the light bent equally, and we'll come to that in a minute. But so specific gravity basically says for the volume of space how heavy it is. And interestingly enough, our lenses all have different specific gravities. And what we'll actually find is some lens materials, and for an example we might use our 1.53. So let's just go back a step, take that one away, and say rather than a cube, let's make a really funny shape. One of those shapes again, a lens, and it has volume. Okay, it's not just two surfaces, it has volume. So because it's got volume in it, it weighs something, and and if you've ever put a glass lens on, and you've picked up probably some sunglasses now that have got glass lenses, and straight away you can feel the weight. They don't look any thicker than the other lens, but they're heavier, because the specific gravity of glass is quite heavy compared to water. So when they talk about specific gravities, they're often things like 1, 1.15, 1.25. I think glass has got a specific gravity of about 1.7. again, it's referencing, so compared to a volume of water, how much heavier it is than water. I was saying glass is about 70% heavier than water. Some of these other lenses are, slightly more dense. They're going to sink to the bottom with water. But interesting, 1.15 is the specific gravity for our 1.53 index material has a specific gravity of 1.15, whereas the specific gravity of 1.5 index is actually about 1.25. So, just in how in that terms it affects things is, this lens here has really good properties, and if you look at the actual lens guide, it'll actually talk about, not about these technical details, but it actually talks about, would you like to read out what it says on single vision sphere about the properties of 1.53?
Yep, extremely tough, almost unbreakable. Kids, in capital letters, lighter and thinner, vastly superior optical properties compared to other impact-resistant materials, and in brackets polycarbonate, not impacted by common household cleaning chemicals, suitable for rimless frames.
Okay, now, of all of that statements, about the second sentence that actually relates to index and specific gravity. It says very light and very thin. So you can have something like glass, there's actually a 1.8 glass, it's very, can't chemically harden it or anything like that. It is ultra thin, easily broken and all the rest of it. So its properties wouldn't be impact resistant and tough, but it is very thin. But even though it's very thin, thinner than just about anything else you can get, because it's a 1.8, it says it's the thinnest it can be made with the most minimal curve to get that power. Because it's got a very high specific gravity, it's still probably about 40%, 50% heavier than a 1.5, which would look 3 times as thick. Not 3 times, but dramatically thicker, and yet this one will be heavier. So the nice thing, if we go back to that, so when we talk about, we'll get rid of all of this because there's a lot of information again. So if we go back to our 153, which is one of our favoured lenses, we'd have to say, because we like it, it's nice and tough and thin and all the rest of it. But one of the things when we talk about that it's really light and really thin, it's not just the thinness that makes it light, it's the fact that its specific